So there is a very famous example, and I would like to take the same example as well, right? I don't want to reinvent the wheel because that example is pretty interesting and simple. So let's try to understand the situation of a restaurant. Okay. So let's try to build kind of like a restaurant for us. Okay. Cool. So what happens in a restaurant? How do you actually go in the restaurant and how the things are actually done? Let's talk about that. So inside a restaurant, let's say there is a client that actually went. Okay. So let's say you are the user or a client. Okay. You actually went to the restaurant. Now what will happen is, who do you communicate inside your restaurant? Like now, let's say you actually went to the restaurant and now you want to order some food, right? You are like hungry and you have some food requirements. Who do you communicate to? Do you directly go inside the kitchen of the restaurant and start ordering? No. Generally, you sit on your table, and from your table, you actually call for a waiter, right? Can I say that? But before calling the waiter, what do? You read the menu. Can I say that? So technically what happens is, there is a menu that you read. Okay. There is a menu that you read. By reading this menu, what happens is that you actually understand what are the features, or I would say technically with respect to restaurant, what are the food items that the restaurant is offering. You try to understand the menu, right? This is the only interface through which you understand what the restaurant offers, right? Once you actually went through the interface and decided that, okay, I want to order this particular food item. So what do? You actually go and start communicating to one more person, right? You actually communicate to this particular person. And who is this person? This person is your waiter. Okay. You are the user. Cool. So what do? You actually communicate with the waiter, right? Sorry, my bad. You actually communicate with the waiter that, hey waiter, I like to have these three food items. Now, do you think waiter actually creates the foods then and there? No. It is not the responsibility of the waiter to create the food, right? And you do not directly go to the kitchen to ask the food, or you do not create the food, right? Nothing happens. So what happens is, technically there is a dedicated kitchen, right? There is a dedicated kitchen. Inside the kitchen, there might be multiple chefs. Okay. So let's say this is, okay, my bad. Oh, how do we rename, man? Let's rename it outside. So let's say chef 1. Okay. And chef 2. Okay. Okay, cool. So let's say inside your kitchen, so this is your kitchen, right? So there is a dedicated kitchen where all the food creation and everything is actually currently happening, right? All the actual action goes on inside the kitchen, right? This action actually goes on inside the kitchen. So what waiter does is, waiter actually takes the request to the kitchen, right? Inside the kitchen, there are multiple chefs, and one of the chef is going to actually take the request, and they are going to give the food back to the waiter, right? They're going to give the food back to the waiter. Can I say that? Once the waiter has the food back, then the waiter brings the food to the user. Can I say that? This is how the cycle works. This is how the cycle works, right? So let me draw it properly. Let's say, yeah. So what happens is, let's go step by step. First step is this, that you make a request to the waiter. Second step is this, that the waiter requests the kitchen. Kitchen has a lot of chefs and everyone who actually does the action. Chef returns the food when the food is prepared after some time. to the waiter, and then the waiter brings the food back to the user. This is technically what I believe, and I believe everyone would agree, actually goes on inside a restaurant. Okay. Now, what is the learning from this whole story? The learning from this whole story is one simple thing. That is two outcomes. Two outcomes we can actually draw. One outcome is SRP, or you can say single responsibility principle, and separation of concern. Okay, these are the two things that should be your technical outcomes out of the whole story, right? These should be the two things. Now let's talk about single responsibility principle. Now just think about it. Don't you think that the life of the waiter will be absolutely hell if waiter starts telling the menu verbally, right? That we have this, and it will be very hard for the user to understand as well, right? So it's not the responsibility of the waiter to remember the whole menu. Yeah, there might be some queries and basic things that waiter has to do. Otherwise, the sole responsibility of the waiter is to take the order from the user, bring it to the kitchen, then take the food from the kitchen and bring it back to the user. That's the only thing that waiter has to do. Similarly, chefs do not go to the table of the waiter to take the order, right? They are going to sit back and relax and wait for the waiter to actually come to the chef, give the order that the customer is asking for, these food items, please prepare it. Once prepared, do let me know. And then chef prepares the food and just gives it back to the waiter somehow. They don't bring it back to the plate of the user, right? So what is this single responsibility principle? Single responsibility principle says that every part of the system has one unique responsibility or one single responsibility. They don't do multiple things. For example, chef cannot act as a waiter or a chef as well. Otherwise, of course, efficiency will not be there. It's not like there are no restaurants where chef do not take the order. There are very small restaurants where chef takes the order also, brings back the order also, very small scale restaurant. But again, the efficiency is not there. They don't work at a very high level scale, right? But if you see big restaurant that actually caters a lot of people, they have separation of concern. And then that they have single responsibility principle, and single responsibility principle leads to separation of concern. Now, what is separation of concern? The waiter doesn't know how the chef created the food, right? Chef doesn't know how waiter takes the order. They know about their own thing. They know what the input to expect, what the output to give, right? Similar thing exists inside web applications as well. In web applications, this menu, you can see that this is the layer where the user is actually interacting. This is the first line of defense. This is the first layer where user actually interacts, see the UI of the whole offerings from the restaurant. So think it with respect to a Zomato application. If you see with respect to an application, can you say this is the mobile app technically, right? Where you actually see the UI and you decide what do you want to do, right? So this part of the menu in actual world is called as the view layer. This is called as the view layer. This menu is called as the view layer. Okay. Then these chefs, now do you think the whole business logic, like let's say it's a Chinese restaurant. So what's the business logic there? How to make Chinese food is the business logic. So the actual core crux of the business logic that is residing inside watch. It's residing inside the kitchen. Can I say that? The kitchen is the business logic. How to prepare the food, how to preserve the food, how to prepare the food, how to make the food tasty. All of that secret recipe and the logic, everything is inside the kitchen, right? And this waiter is trying to act like a mediator that takes the request from the user and bring it to the business logic part. This is called as controller layer. Okay, this is called as the controller layer. Let me bring it here. Okay, this is called as the controller layer. Okay, so I'll mark all of these arrows with blue, which actually defines the terms. Okay, cool. So you can see that there are three layers in which we have actually segregated our whole working. There is a view layer on which the user interacts. When the user interacts, the first request comes to the controller. The only responsibility of the controller is to take the request from the user and take it to the business logic, that is the model layer, right? And when the model layer gives you the response back, then take it back to the user. This is a simple story of a restaurant, and this responsibility of each of the actors is defined in technical terms as a view layer, controller layer, and model layer. And together, if you club all of these together, this makes your MVC architecture. This is technically your MVC architecture altogether. So when you define MVC architecture, means model view controller. View is the view layer where you actually define how the looks and feel of the application will be. Model layer is the layer where you define the business logic, the stored data and everything. Controller layer has only one responsibility. Take the request, take the incoming request and pass it on to the service, or I would say model layer. And when the model layer has give you a response back, then take it back to the user. That's it. And a lot of modern frameworks like Ruby on Rails, Django and everything, which are opinionated, actually follows this MVC architecture. If you remember, I talked about that Express is unopinionated, right? Express is unopinionated means Express doesn't enforce you to do something in a certain way. For example, in this particular type of a file also, if I write the whole server in a single file, then also Express doesn't have a problem. But there are opinionated frameworks as well, like Rails, like Django. They heavily follow this MVC architecture. So if I actually show you a Ruby on Rails code repository, right? If you see a Ruby on Rails code repository, can you see there is something called as a controllers, models, and the views, right? So generally in scalable applications, this kind of a model view controller kind of an architecture is followed. But there is a catch. There are two important things that you have to understand. One, this model view architecture is a bit old. At that point of time, things like React and Angular were not that famous. Currently, if you see, if you make a front end, then you make a different React project altogether. You do not club your front end code in the backend project only, right? If you see, like there is a support like in Express. What you can do is, if you don't want to work with React kind of a thing, or like you want to customize all the I would say UI from the backend, so there can be I would say server side rendering you can do. Currently we do client side rendering nowadays. When we use React, what do you use? Client side rendering. That JavaScript handles everything for the rendering part, right? But you can do server side rendering also, that on the server we populate an HTML and send that HTML on the client. Okay, so Express also can support that. But nowadays we don't do it. Nowadays you will very rarely find new apps, or I would say even very big MNCs, old MNCs also, they don't follow this architecture. Generally this view layer has now been segregated out. There will be a different project or a different service altogether, like a different React project, which will be handling your view layer. That means what to show to the user. And this controller layer and the model layer is nowadays left inside your backend. So earlier, if I talk about a framework like Ruby on Rails, so if you use Ruby on Rails, then in versions 4 and 5 of Ruby on Rails, what used to happen was this folder, views folder, used to by default come up. All these folders used to by default come in Ruby on Rails because it's opinionated. It enforces you to follow the MVC architecture, and the views folder used to be absolutely there. Either you manually remove it, otherwise by default it will be there. Then in later versions of Rails, I guess with 5 point something version, and then with version 6, what they gave a support is that if you are defining a Rails project, then you can make a absolutely API driven app. That means no view altogether. View will be separate. You can make a separate React project altogether and then just communicate. So there is no view folder in that kind of case, right? So nowadays those frameworks have also given a support, but because Express is unopinionated, we can decide what do we want to build. So in our backend project, because we are going to make everything API driven, the client is going to make an API request and we are going to give an API response. We are going to follow more on this controller and model layer. So this was the first catch, that nowadays view layer has been segregated out. Together it still is considered as an MVC architecture. With React also it is considered MVC architecture, but in the coding perspective, you code it in a separate code repository, separate project altogether. Now coming to the second catch, the controller layer is still good, but this model layer, now even if you see with respect to the business logic, think it with respect to the kitchen. Now In kitchen, there are two things. One is food, raw food items, and second, chef using those raw food items to prepare the food. Think about it like this. If there are only chefs in the kitchen, then also no food will be prepared. If there are just raw material in the kitchen, then also, and no chefs, then also no food will be prepared. So needs to be existence of the chef and the raw material. Think it about with respect to the backend application, that the raw materials, the raw vegetables and the food items are data, right? And the chef are actually the business logic, because chef has everything in their mind how to prepare the food, but to prepare the food they need raw materials, they need data, right? So technically even this model layer is doing a lot of things. It has to take care of the vegetables also, then it has to take care of management of chef, because there might be multiple chefs. Which chef is good in what kind of a food, we don't know. Like a lot of things is still going on in this model layer. So nowadays, if you see latest code repositories, this model layer is also segregated out into two different layers. This model layer is nowadays also segregated out in two different layers, right? One layer is called as a service and one layer is called as a repository. Okay. One layer is called as a service layer. One layer is called as a repository layer, right? This model has been nowadays segregated out in service and repository, right? What is the role of repository? Repository layer handles everything about data, how to fetch the data, how to get the data, all of that thing. Service layer handles business logic. So service layer handles business logic and repository layer handles data. Okay, so technically together with service layer and repository layer, we still call both of them together as the model part. But nowadays, if you see modern applications, people have a dedicated service layer and repository layer. And this kind of a code structure is followed in other frameworks as well. If you see a like scaled architecture of a Spring Boot application or a Django application or Rails application that actually is going on in the industry, you will find there is a service layer, there is a repository layer altogether. So we're going to talk about these segregations like service segregation, repository segregation. In fact, nowadays controller layer has also been segregated out because of a few reasons. There is something called as a middleware layer and a controller layer. So we'll talk more about it. But overall, even if you don't understand this segregation of model layer, don't worry, we are going to talk more about it. But this MVC is something that you have to definitely understand, that what is MVC. MVC makes sure that different roles is allocated to different part of the project. They don't know about how others are doing their job, they just know their job and handles that particular thing.